Good Times did not begin as a story about scandal. It began as a story about the Evans family, a proud black family in a small Chicago apartment, fighting poverty with love, discipline, humor, and hope. But behind the laughter, the real cast of Good Times was being pulled apart. John Amos, who gave James Evans his strength and dignity, was removed from the show after clashing with producers over its direction. Esther Roll, who made Florida Evans the emotional heart of the family, would also walk away. And the catchphrase that made millions laugh, "Dynamite," became part of a deeper conflict over what Good Times was supposed to represent. Some cast members became television icons. Some spent years trying to escape the shadow of a single role. And some reached heartbreaking final chapters that longtime fans never expected. More than 50 years later, the Evans family is still remembered with love. But the story behind the show is far more complicated than the sitcom America watched each week. To understand what happened, we have to return to 1974, when viewers first opened the door to that unforgettable apartment. In 1974, Good Times opened the door to a small apartment in Chicago and introduced America to the Evans family. James and Florida Evans did not have much money, but they had pride. They worked, argued, worried, and laughed their way through a life shaped by rent, job insecurity, and the constant pressure of trying to give their children something better. JJ filled the room with jokes and restless energy. Thelma brought intelligence, grace, and ambition. Michael, the youngest, asked questions about justice that were often larger than the apartment itself. And Willona Woods arrived with style, humor, and the kind of loyalty that made her feel like family. For viewers, Good Times was more than another sitcom. It was a rare television portrait of a black family facing hardship without surrendering its dignity. But as the show became more popular, the balance began to shift. The laughter grew louder. One character became impossible to ignore, and the family at the center of Good Times was about to change forever. What happened next turned Good Times into one of the most complicated success stories in classic television. Behind the familiar laughter were arguments about representation, creative control, and the kind of family the Evanses were allowed to be. John Amos would be pushed out. Esther Roll would leave. Jimmy Walker would become a cultural phenomenon, while the phrase that made him famous also placed him at the center of a controversy that followed the cast for decades. In this story, we will look back at the Good Times cast then and now, the careers they built after the show, the conflicts that changed their lives, who is still alive in 2026, and the heartbreaking final fate of the stars America once welcomed into its home. John Amos gave Good Times its backbone. As James Evans, he was not written as a perfect father. He was proud, stubborn, exhausted, and often angry at a world that seemed determined to keep his family struggling. But beneath that frustration was something audiences recognized immediately: a man who would do anything to protect his wife, his children, and the dignity of his home. Amos brought a force to James that made even the smallest scenes feel important. A conversation about rent, a lost job, or a child's future could become a statement about responsibility and survival. For many viewers, James Evans was one of the first black fathers on television who felt fully human, strong without being invulnerable, loving without being sentimental. That was why Amos cared so deeply about the direction of Good Times. He believed the Evans family should be more than a setting for jokes. He wanted Michael's intelligence, Thelma's ambition, and James and Florida's struggle to remain at the center of the story. When the show began leaning more heavily toward JJ's comedy, Amos pushed back. His objections were not quiet, and they eventually cost him his place in the series. James Evans was killed off, leaving the family and millions of viewers to grieve a father who had seemed impossible to replace. But Hollywood did not define John Amos by one departure. His powerful work in Roots proved the depth of his talent, and his later career carried him far beyond the walls of the Evans apartment. Still, the conflict that removed him from Good Times was only beginning to reveal how divided the cast had become. The conflict at the heart of Good Times was never as simple as one actor against another. Jimmy Walker had created something television could not ignore. As J.J. Evans, he was lanky, unpredictable, endlessly expressive, and capable of turning a single word into a national phenomenon. Dynamite became more than a catchphrase. It became part of American pop culture, repeated in schoolyards, living rooms, and comedy clubs across the country. But the louder the laughter became, the more John Amos and Esther Roll feared the show was losing something important. Good Times had begun as the story of a family trying to survive with dignity. James and Florida Evans were parents who wanted their children to dream beyond the walls of their apartment. Michael was thoughtful and politically aware. Thelma was intelligent, ambitious, and determined to build a better future. Yet as J.J.'s popularity grew, the show increasingly leaned into his comedy. To Amos and Roll, the concern was not that Jimmy Walker was talented. He clearly was. The concern was that the Evans family risked becoming less complex, while J.J. risked becoming a stereotype that audiences laughed at, instead of a young man they understood. Amos challenged the writers and producers directly. He later acknowledged that his approach was not always diplomatic, but his frustration came from a belief that Good Times had a responsibility larger than ratings. The result was devastating. James Evans was written out of the series, his death announced in one of the show's most painful moments. The family lost its father, and the program lost the force that had held much of its emotional weight together. Esther Roll remained, but the same concerns followed her. The phrase that had made America laugh had become a symbol of a deeper struggle over who controlled the story and what the Evans family was allowed to represent. Soon, Florida Evans would also make a choice that changed Good Times forever. Esther Roll was the heart of Good Times long before the Evans family became a television institution. As Florida Evans, she brought warmth, discipline, faith, and a quiet strength that made the family believable. Florida could comfort her children, challenge her husband, and hold the apartment together even when money was short and hope was difficult to find. But Roll's commitment to the character went far beyond performance. She believed Florida Evans should represent a strong black mother whose dignity was never reduced to a joke. When Good Times was developed from her character's earlier appearance on Maude, Roll fought for Florida to have a husband in the home. She wanted viewers to see a family struggling together, not another household defined by absence. That belief made the changes in the series especially painful for her. After John Amos left and James Evans was killed off, Florida remained the emotional center of the show. But Roll continued to worry that the stories were moving away from the family's original purpose. Eventually, she walked away as well, leaving Good Times without both of the parents who had once given it its moral foundation. She returned for the final season, but the Evans family could never feel exactly as it had before. Esther Roll continued acting after the series and earned recognition for roles far removed from Florida Evans. She died in 1998 at the age of 78, leaving behind a character whose strength still resonates with viewers. Florida taught her children never to surrender their dignity. Esther Roll lived by the same rule. And after the parents were gone, the actor at the center of the show's greatest controversy was left to carry a fame that would follow him for the rest of his life. If Good Times was part of your family's television memories, subscribe to Hollywood After Fame and share which member of the Evans family you remember most, because the story was far from over. The young actor, whose catchphrase helped divide the show, would spend the rest of his life living beneath the shadow of Dynamite, and one of the cast's most beloved women would leave behind a second television legacy that millions of viewers heard for years without ever realizing the voice belonged to her. Jimmy Walker became the face of Good Times almost overnight. As J.J. Evans, he brought a loose, electric energy into the apartment. His expressions were bigger than life, his timing was sharp, and when he shouted, "Dynamite!" the audience responded as if they had been waiting all week to hear it. That success made Walker a television icon. It also placed him at the center of a conflict he did not create alone. To John Amos and Esther Roll, the concern was what J.J. might come to represent if the comedy overwhelmed the character's intelligence, vulnerability, and dreams. To millions of viewers, however, J.J. was simply unforgettable. Walker had found a way to make a struggling young man feel joyful, defiant, and impossible to ignore. After Good Times ended, Walker continued working as a comedian and actor, returning again and again to live audiences who still wanted to hear the word that had made him famous. Decades later, he remained closely identified with J.J., a reminder of both the power and the burden of a role that becomes larger than the person who played it. In 2024, Walker reunited with Bernadette Stanis and Ralph Carter for the show's 50th anniversary, proving that the affection surrounding Good Times had never disappeared. J.J. Evans gave Jimmy Walker a place in television history. But the next beloved member of the cast left behind a second legacy that many fans never knew was hers. While J.J. became the loudest voice in the Evans apartment, Thelma and Michael represented the future James and Florida were fighting to protect. Bernadette Stanis brought intelligence, grace, and quiet determination to Thelma Evans. She was more than the family's beautiful daughter. Thelma had ambition, opinions, and the strength to imagine a life beyond the limits placed around her. For many young viewers, she became a rare television character who could be glamorous without losing her depth. After Good Times, Stanis continued acting, writing, and speaking about the lasting impact of the show. She remained closely connected to fans who still saw Thelma as one of the most memorable daughters in classic television. Ralph Carter gave Michael Evans a different kind of strength. Michael was the youngest child, but he was often the one asking the hardest questions about race, justice, and opportunity. Carter had already earned attention on Broadway before joining Good Times, and his stage experience gave Michael a confidence beyond his years. Unlike some of his castmates, Carter later stepped away from the center of the entertainment industry and lived a quieter life. But whenever he returned for reunions, viewers were reminded of the thoughtful boy who believed the world could be changed. Thelma and Michael were the promise of the Evans family, and the next woman in their lives would become far more than a neighbor. Janae Dubois entered Good Times as Willona Woods, the stylish neighbor who could fill the Evans apartment with laughter before she even reached the door. Willona was independent, outspoken, and impossible to overlook. She brought humor into the family's hardest moments, but she was never only comic relief. As the series changed and the Evans household lost both James and Florida, Willona became something more important, a steady presence, a protector, and eventually a mother figure to Penny. Dubois gave Willona a confidence that felt modern. She was a woman who had built a life of her own, yet she never hesitated to stand beside the people she loved. Her bond with the Evans family helped keep the emotional heart of Good Times alive during its later years. But many viewers never realized that Janae Dubois had already left another unforgettable mark on television. She was the voice behind "Movin' On Up," the iconic theme song from The Jeffersons. Long after Willona stepped away from the Evans apartment, Dubois's voice continued opening the door to another beloved television family. She died in 2020, leaving behind two legacies that remain deeply connected to classic American television: the neighbor who became family, and the voice that still announces a family's rise every time The Jeffersons begins. Willona brought joy into Good Times. Janae Dubois left a voice that television could never forget. And beyond the Evans family, several other familiar faces also reached final chapters of their own. Beyond the Evans family, Good Times was filled with familiar faces who helped make the apartment building feel like a world of its own. Johnny Brown became unforgettable as Nathan Bookman, the building superintendent who was often the target of JJ's jokes, but always returned with his own sense of pride. Brown brought warmth to a character who could easily have been only a punchline. He died in 2022 at the age of 84, and no official cause of death was publicly confirmed. Ben Powers joined the final season as Keith Anderson, the football player who married Thelma and seemed to represent the future she had always imagined. His time on the series was brief, but his place in the Evans family remained memorable. Powers died in 2015 at the age of 64. Moses Gunn faced one of the most difficult assignments in the show's history as Carl Dixon, the man who entered Florida's life after James. Gunn was already a respected stage and screen actor, and he gave Carl a seriousness that helped the character stand on his own. He died in 1993 at the age of 64. And then there was Janet Jackson, who joined Good Times as Penny, a vulnerable young girl adopted by Willona. She would later become one of the most famous recording artists in the world. Together, these faces expanded the story of Good Times. But before we say goodbye, it is time to look clearly at who is still alive and who has reached their final chapter. More than 50 years after Good Times first entered American homes, the final fate of its cast tells a story of survival, loss, and lasting memory. John Amos, the proud and powerful James Evans, died in 2024 at the age of 84. His death certificate listed congestive heart failure. Esther Roll, the unforgettable Florida Evans, died in 1998 at 78 from complications of diabetes. Janae Dubois, who gave Willona Woods her style and warmth, died in 2020. Her death certificate listed cardiac arrest, with other health conditions contributing. Johnny Brown, remembered as Nathan Bookman, died in 2022 at 84, while Ben Powers, who played Keith Anderson, died in 2015 at 64. Their official causes of death were not publicly confirmed. Jimmy Walker, Bernadette Stannis, and Ralph Carter remain the surviving core members of the Evans children's generation, still connected in the public memory to JJ, Thelma, and Michael. Janet Jackson, who played Penny, went on to build a global career far beyond the series. Some members of the Good Times family became legends. Some left the spotlight. Others are gone, but their voices still echo through the Evans apartment. And that is why the show's final legacy is about more than fame, conflict, or loss. Good Times was never only about a family living through difficult circumstances. It was about what people hold on to when the world gives them very little. The Evans family did not have wealth, comfort, or certainty, but they had pride, they had love, and they had the determination to keep moving forward, even when every setback seemed designed to break them. Behind the scenes, the cast did not always agree on what the show should become. There were conflicts, painful departures, creative battles, and losses that changed the series forever. Yet those disagreements also revealed how deeply the actors cared about the people they were portraying and the families watching at home. More than 50 years later, Good Times is remembered not only for laughter or dynamite. It is remembered because the Evans family made struggle feel human, dignity feel powerful, and hope feel possible. The apartment door may have closed long ago, but the voices inside it still remain. Which member of the Good Times cast meant the most to you?